So what is the responsibility of institutions of higher education for the communities they inhabit? And how do they nurture students as citizens and leaders for the emerging world? These 21st century questions are evolving the traditional ivory tower. Christopher Howard is the first African-American president of an historically white, all-male school in the South, Hampton-Sydney College of Virginia. So this question, again, how would you trace the roots of your passion, personal, spiritual, as well as intellectual?
Sure, because my father was a veteran of the Vietnam War. My uncle did 2 tours. They're both combat veterans, my Bronze Star recipients. And so I saw that those uniforms in my closet as a kid. And then I saw a picture of a West Point cadet when I was in 7th grade, going back to the formative years in your life. So here I'm in Plano, Texas. I see a picture of a West Point cadet, and I said, I'm going to be a West Pointer, which is, I'm thinking about the public sphere as public service, as in military service. That's how I came into this. But I wrote a letter to my congressman. I said, I'm Chris Howard. I'm a good student. I'm a good athlete. You need to give me an appointment to West Point when I turn 18. He says, you seem like a bright young man, but I'm not your congressman. So I'd written the letter to the wrong person, but he forwarded it. He said, this guy has hope. He can't figure out our address. So I ended up going to the United States Air Force Academy rather than West Point. And not because I wrote the letter to the wrong place. It just worked out better that way. But I was always thinking, one to whom much is given, much is also expected. And I think about the public sector and citizenry and that whole rubric in terms of what is the obligation that I have, that my family has, that my town has, that we as a society have, to ensure that we can have a civilization, that we can have a society.
Okay. And this may seem like a simple point, but sometimes it's worth saying the simplest things. Our educational institutions are the places in the society where we learn to ask good questions, right? Where we cultivate that particular skill.
We had a board meeting recently, and I had a board member say something about our athletic program, and he said that basically a lot of the learning can happen in the athletic program when done properly. It doesn't, to your point, Nancy, have to be in the wonderful wood-paneled, cloistered room. Things and the tools out there that weren't as evident, at least even when I was a student at the Air Force Academy in the late 80s, early 90s, experiential learning, service learning.
Yeah.
They've been around, but I think they're much more a part of our vernacular.
You've also talked about, Hampton-Sydney at one point was known as a finishing school for Southern gentlemen. But I really like the way you talk about the word gentleman. You say the operative word is gentleman. Would you talk a little bit about what that means for you and how you're implementing that as part of culture?
Yeah, sure, and I'll talk a little bit probably about humility as well. But so the term gentleman is problematic amongst many people, but this whole idea of a gentleman, which means that you don't intentionally do something to harm others. So to walk through life and not intentionally do harm to others is pretty cool. And I think that young men, they can get their minds around that. So when we take our respective roles as chancellors and presidents, as parents, as citizens, we got to be humble because there's so much that we just don't know, a law of unintended consequences, et cetera. And so I think that's a good virtue, I guess, for us to live by in this wonderful world we live in together.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right, well, let's open this up. Here's a microphone.
In an age of evidence, what are the metrics around civic engagement that we as leaders can take back out into our communities to talk about success?
So one of the things that I've been doing with young people as I've entered it, even as a mentor when I was in industry and in the military, nonprofit, and now as an educator, is that I want them to have a sense of agency. When people on our campus, students on our campus want to do something, I like to make sure that our administration, our faculty, our alumni help them do that, because I want them to know that if they do A, and it's not against the law, that B can happen. You want people in a school system that's not working well to run for school board or to do something to affect change in that school system when they've graduated from your institution to make a difference. You want them to do the same thing with maybe a corporation is misappropriating land or something like that. You want them to be able to say, I can do something about this. Or even inside the firm themselves, they can be working for a company and say, this is not right, and not out of hubris, but out of responsibility, make a change. And that's agency. That's what I want. I want men and women to walk off a campus and be able to know that they do A, they can have B happen, and they can have some input and control, because a lot of places in the world, people just don't have that.
In my show, I'll often ask at the end, through all the experiences you've had and what we've been talking about, how is your sense of what it means to be human evolved? And with this conversation in mind that we've just had about education and humanity and connecting who we are and who the world is, both institutionally and personally, how would you answer that question, what you've learned about, what it means to be an educated human being?
Education is a lifelong process. This is a film, not a snapshot. So when I was in flight school as an Air Force officer, I had a classmate named Mark, and his wife was Kathy. He was an Army reservist. I was an Air Force officer. We were going to Fort Rucker, helicopter training, and we would have these long talks about the Civil War and what it meant to society in America and the role of the Confederacy in our history. And he had relatives that had fought what I like to call the losing side. I'm just saying they did lose. Point of fact, some of my friends forget that, but nonetheless. But we have this and I'm a trained military guy, and so I knew the stories of the Confederate generals and understood where he was coming from. We'd have these great conversations. And then when we finished up flight school, my wife and we only had one son at the time, went down to Disney World. We got some tickets off the Morale, Welfare, and Recreation office at Fort Rucker. We drive down to Tampa to stay with him because we're going to go to Disney World in Orlando the next day. So we show up with our 4-year-old son, my wife being a colored, so-called colored, from South Africa. We knock on the door. Kathy's there. She opens the door. We talk for a few minutes. It's rather late. We go into the bedroom. And on his bed, there was a couple of pillows, and they were Confederate flag pillows. They were the Confederate flag. And this is interesting. He takes the pillows, and he puts them in a chest, and his wife, and they make the bed for us because it was a small apartment, and we stayed in their bed. They stayed somewhere else. It wasn't that kind of story. They stayed someplace else. But what was interesting is that I thought that is the best of a civil relationship, right, in so many ways. I know some of you are laughing trying to get your mind around this, but think about it, though. He did not run and hide that. We talked about what it meant to him. I understood that, and I respected that. I didn't, a lot of people, it would have turned out very differently at a lot of other people of color. It showed up at the door. But it was not that. It was us. It was Mark and Kathy and Barbara and Chris and Cohen, and we knew each other, and we took time to respect our respective points of view, which allowed us to have a deep relationship. And so that's the story that I use. It kind of speaks to some of the things you're speaking to. And so
it's about living with.
Living with. Mm-hmm. Living with.
Christopher Howard is the first African-American president of an historically white, all-male school in the South, Hampton-Sydney College of Virginia.